Well, thanks to Craig and Apologetics Ministry for inviting me to this. I love interdisciplinary forums, and I'd wanted to read Brett's book, and this made me do it. So that's a good thing too. My name is Todd Picket. I'm the Dean of Spiritual Development, but also, as Craig mentioned, my background is in literary studies and spiritual development. And toward the beginning of Brett's book, and I'll alternately refer to him as Brett and McCracken for reasons I have no idea why in my text, but there it is. He says this. He says, by the end of the book, my hope is not that readers will have learned how to be hip. Rather, I hope that they will have been provoked into some necessary conversations, discourse, and soul-searching about the meaning of cool for their lives and their faith. And Brett, it's really, I find it to have been very provocative in a great way. I mean, I know when I've read a great book because it's generative for me. It just is provocative. And Hipster Christianity was really that way for me. And I just want to share a little bit about, I kind of want to lift a few themes from Brett's book that I found to be particularly generative, and to reframe them in the context of spiritual development, which is to follow, Brett's encouragement to have this be kind of soul-searching about the meaning of cool for our lives and our faith. And so I guess my question kind of is, from a spiritual development standpoint, is what can we learn about working out our salvation, our sanctification, amid a culture and craving for cool? How can thinking deeply about this help us understand how we are to go on in our own sanctification? So in the few minutes I have, I'll probably mostly be admiring Brett's observations and evaluations and just really extending them. But I do want to begin initially where Brett ends. I think this is pretty close to the final paragraph in his book. And he's talking about, he actually mentions Plato's identification of something called thumos in us, desire. And he says this, Brett says this, the aspect of ourself that produces an insatiable desire for recognition. This is his definition of thumos, the definition of thumos that Plato talks about. And this is now Brett, of course. We want esteem, prestige, and affirmation of our worth. Hegel posited that this is ultimately the desire that drives history. It's not food that drives history. It's not mere survival. But it's this deep desire for recognition. Well, I think that deserves some acknowledgement and thought. And so I guess off of that, I have kind of two theses that Brett's book kind of made me think of. That this deep desire for recognition that he suggests at the end kind of drives our desire for cool really reminds me that to be human is to be needy. That this need that is driving the need for cool is a kind of icon for the fact that to be human is to be needy. And I'll say the corollary is this: being needy is not cool. And that this is a kind of problem for hipster Christianity or for our fascination with cool. That being needy is not cool. Brett elsewhere gives some descriptions of cool that I think kind of press on this a little bit. He defines it as an attractive attribute, we're talking about cool now, that embodies the existential strains to be independent, enviable, one of a kind, and trailblazing. Or the inherent desire not for wealth, but for autonomy. And here I think he's actually quoting hipster historian, I guess you call him a hipstorian, John Leland. So both these desire for independent and the desire for autonomy as features of being cool suggest that to be cool is to at least pretend that you do not need anyone or anything else. That you're autonomous, you're independent, which is to say not dependent on anyone or anything. And I think, as Brett has already alluded, he says in another place, the essence of cool is in being different, standing out or leading the pack, the instinct to be better than everyone. So clearly, if you lead the pack, in some sense, you're saying, I do not need it. I can just lead it. Of course, the paradox at the heart of this is what Brett also says elsewhere, that while features of cool are autonomy and independence, not needing, in fact, to be cool, you do need something. You have the desire to be noticed, to be esteemed, to be envied. You need people to envy you, to notice you, to esteem you. And so I guess I would kind of posit that cool, kind of moving from Brett's comments, cool is this kind of apparent autonomy, this saying, I don't need these other things. I am independent, I'm autonomous, but it's always this autonomy with a sideward glance. I'm always looking quickly to the left or the right and saying, how am I doing in the mirror of people's perceptions? So as part of cool, there is this kind of apparent autonomy, but there's always the checking. There's always, in a sense, a dependence on other people's perception. I'm beginning to sound self-righteous. But this self-consciousness, this self-absorption of the hipster is really not limited to the hipster. I think it implicates all of us. It's driven by what Brett calls, by some of the same instincts and preoccupations that drive anyone else, and that's a quote from the book. Could it be that the desire for cool is, in a sense, all of us, in all of us, that's driving our own preoccupations and instincts? In other words, what drives the hipster, what drives the need to be cool is deep in all of us. And I would suggest kind of what drives this desire for recognition, for to be cool, we find not only this moment in history, or this moment in culture that Brett's documents, but is in fact all the way back. And I think we see it even in Genesis. Because the desire to be cool, the desire to be esteemed, to be recognized, while good insofar as it kind of suggests that we're needy, isn't a kind of an attempt to cover and hide. I guess I would suggest that my desire for coolness is often my attempt to cover and hide. And of course, we see this early on in Genesis 3, right? As soon as Adam and Eve disobey God, they instinctively sense that something's been broken within them. They instinctively sense that something is wrong. They instinctively sense their need for something now, something that has broken. They're self-conscious. And so what are the first two things they do? They cover and they hide. We can almost say that the original sin was inspired the first wave of fashion. Clothing suddenly was needed to cover my sense that something's broken. I need something to cover my shame and my guilt. And it's interesting to me that that first bit of clothing also connects to the fact that Brett brings up in his book, he didn't mention it, but that clothing is very important to the hipster. Interesting that clothing is our first attempt as humans to cover and hide. So in any event, what is born at that moment of human sin was the desire to cover and hide the broken self. We need to find some way of coping with that. And it's what psychologists call the false self that develops from this, whereby you and I learn from almost an early age to find something that is going to cover and hide my shame and guilt. And we all discover it rather early on. If we're good at athletics, we throw our whole self into athletics because we sense if I can be just a great athlete, I can use that to cover me. Some of us gravitate toward academics. If I can just be really great academically, I can use that academics to kind of cover me, to help me hide my inadequacies, my fears, my shame. Some of us may find it in our kind of social prowess or attractiveness. Being popular, making money, even doing ministry, being good can be a way you and I cover and hide. Desperately seeking some way like clothing to cover ourselves. Even being good at being bad. Some kids grow up being good at being bad. It becomes kind of a special mark of distinction. Well, I would say that one of the things Brett has done brilliantly in his book is to expose one of the ways that our culture covers and hides. If we can just be cool. If we can just be cool, I can cover and hide my shame and my guilt in the eyes of others. And I think what he's kind of exposed is kind of a cultural pathology, at least insofar as it exists. The cultural pathology of how we, at our particular point in history, now in the 50s it could have been morality that we used to cover and hide, trying to be good. But now at this point in history, Brett's kind of exposed, at least on the negative side of cool, that this is a device that you and I use to cover and hide. It has become our righteousness. We think it'll save us to some degree. So why, if we have Christ's righteousness, is the negative desire for cool that has kind of gripped us? Why, if we have Christ's righteousness, is this a temptation for the Christian? Because we have Christ's righteousness. We are, in a sense, covered. Why do we not see that the gospel has rescued us from the tyranny of having to be cool? Well, I just want to, in the closing minutes, I just want to kind of look at a spiritual developmental model that might help us explain why you and I are so tempted, if you put yourself in this category. I certainly do. In fact, I was at a concert recently in LA. There's a new band you talk about things changing so quickly. This band has come up in between the time that you wrote the book, and it's I won't even name the name of the band. But this band, I think, is the new cool band for Christians to like. And it was at the Hollywood Palladium. They're not a Christian band, but there's like a Christian in the band, and it's one of those things where they're perfectly positioned to be cool, but not on a Christian label. And I love these guys. They're great. They're fantastic. And I was there with my daughter, and we were at the Hollywood Palladium enjoying a good time. And there were a bunch of other Biola students there, and they're like, Dr. Pickett, Dr. Pickett. And they're like, what is he doing here? What is he doing here? Old guy, what's he doing here? And I almost took as much pleasure in being seen there, being seen to be cool, as I took in the band. So I'm implicated in this, as this is all to say. So why is that? Why is it such a temptation to Christians? Well, let me suggest, using this one particular model called The Critical Journey, written by a couple of sociologists and theologians, Gulick and Hagberg, stages in the life of faith. They talk about 6 stages. And of course, for hundreds of years, theologians, even thousands of years, theologians have looked at and noticed that the Christian life sometimes, although one size doesn't fit all, sometimes falls into certain patterns and stages. And they identify 6. And of course, one would be the conversion stage. And this is when, of course, we come to faith. If you came to faith or recommitted your life, this is the moment when we suddenly get it. The Holy Spirit has opened us up to the truth that nothing we can do, no ability, no goodness, no image, no excellence, no victory amid competition can rescue us from the shame and guilt of our sin and our slavery to sin. And so when we hear the gospel, we suddenly understand by the work of the Spirit that he who had no sin was made sin for us that we might become the righteousness of God. And it frees us from our efforts to self-atone, to try and find our salvation in anything that we might be able to conjure by ourselves, including freedom from the law of cool, trying to be cool enough to find acceptance. So at conversion, we get it. At conversion, you and I get it that we bring nothing. We have great need, and only Christ can meet us in this place of shame and guilt. Only he can cover us. We get it at conversion. But then what happens? Well, good things happen. Many of you notice if you kind of came to Christ as a teen or an adult, after the conversion stage follows the learning and discipleship stage, where suddenly you and I we cannot get enough of church. We cannot get enough of the scriptures. We cannot get enough of fellowship. We cannot get enough of prayer. There's a tremendous period of just diving into learning what this new faith is, learning how we could live it, studying the scriptures. And then a third stage I recognize is what we call the active or productive stage, in which now we've kind of moved from learning about it and often very quickly into working for it. And now we're involved in ministry. We're discovering our spiritual gifts. We're involved in Bible studies, leading Bible studies maybe, involved in church work. Well, this is all good. And this is all kind of naturally often the way it goes for us. This can happen, by the way, very quickly in the life of a Christian. This can happen within a year or two, where you move from conversion to discipleship to active and productive engagement in the life of faith. And this can all be good. Although there is, at this point, the possibility that we're in the grip of a great temptation. Because having come to Christ, knowing that we had great need, and we needed his atonement, needed his gospel, we have begun in this process to understand some other ways that we can excel. Wow, I can not only study the Bible, but I'm pretty good at Bible study. I'm pretty good at learning these truths. Or wow, I'm a pretty good worship leader. Or wow, I'm pretty good at leading small groups. I'm very effective in ministry. And this is all good and natural. We begin to discover our competencies and skills. The great temptation will be this, that old habits die hard. And we begin to say, or we don't say anything, we begin to feel, this is my identity. The effective worship leader. The smart biblical Christian. And the great temptation is when we begin to find these identities, and we will now use these, because old habits die hard, we begin to use these to cover ourselves. And while we believe in the atonement, it kind of goes on file. And we begin to try and justify ourselves by our competencies and excellencies. This is what Paul will call the flesh. He'll get after the Galatians about this. He'll say, how did you slide back into the law? Well, Hogberg and Gulick eventually say that some of us in our journey will hit a wall here. Not necessarily, but sometimes. And the wall will come in a variety of ways. If we have begun to slide out of relying upon for our identity, for our righteousness, if we've begun to slide away from the cross, back into kind of identity seeking, at some point we'll hit a wall, and it may be manifested by a few things. One may be a moral failure. We may have thought we were immune, but suddenly at this great need that we have that we haven't been going to God with, but we've been using other things to satisfy it, we'll simply kind of break out in some moral way. And this is why that explains why such very effective pastors will one day be preaching and the Spirit will seem to be on them and all these things. And the next day we heard they've had a moral collapse. We say, how does that happen? Well, there was a little bit of slippage from the gospel. It could actually happen as a result of a certain fatigue or dryness, as we kept trying to keep that identity up. The good worship leader, or the smart person, it becomes, as Brett says of Hipster Christianity, it can become very competitive. Even just the desire to keep being cool, to keep doing the newest things, we begin to get so fatigued in trying to keep up the identity, that we just get tired of it all. Another thing that can happen is we can become so disillusioned with ourselves. We can suddenly wake up and go, this whole journey so far, it's been all about me. I just see that. It's been all about me trying to be cool enough or trying to be good enough. And what they'll sometimes do is confuse their failure with the failure of the gospel, and they'll walk away from faith. Well, this all can happen as there's kind of a slippage from the gospel. And of course, this is maybe what people like Brett and others are sensing. There's a little bit of suspicion, like, is this kind of all about trying to be cool? Well, that's a great question. And at this point, these two critics will say, another way you could do it is this at this point. You can re-journey back into the gospel. You can acknowledge that we have a great need that nothing beside Christ will fill. And people at this point, if they don't kind of implode, go back to the gospel in their lives. And they begin to serve the world out of love, not out of a searching for identity, not out of a desire to be competent, not a desire to be cool, but they actually go back to the gospel and back into love. And they begin ministry afresh, whereas at the active or productive stage 3, now they're in stage 5 going back into ministry, but now with humility, knowing their great need. And eventually, if we live long enough, maybe we'll get to even forgetfulness of self altogether in love for others. Well, I don't know if I'll live that long. I don't know if my maturity will last that long. But I think Brett is so right, or McCracken is so right, that when it comes down to it, this book, and maybe this whole topic about cool and Christianity, concerns Christian identity. Are we find our identity in Christ's righteousness? Or even in our Christianity, even in our coolness? Well, time's running short, and I'm just going to skip. Let me just say a few things about, from a spiritual development point of view, how do we cope with this temptation? One person that has really helped me, it's already been mentioned, is Eugene Peterson. And if you haven't read some of his works, I think Eugene Peterson is very good. In a world of kind of mounting hype and glitter and hipsterism, I think he's dedicated himself more than anyone I know to the quiet, obscure, patient, spiritual formation, life of prayer, growth in holiness, and deep reception of the gospel that may help us defend a little bit against the temptations to find our identity. In particular, if we had time, we'd probably look at his discussion of Jesus' temptations, which all of which could be actually classified as Satan trying to tempt Jesus to be cool. Throw yourself off the temple. Turn these stones into bread. Or just through sheer force of charisma, I'll give you all the kingdoms. You can just have them. You don't have to die. Well, it's an interesting discussion. So I think Peterson's kind of a reliable check. Of course, he's an older guy, not likely to be employed in churches. And that's what I worry about. Some of these people who've gotten to stage 4, 5, and 6 in the journey, who've moved beyond this fascination with our own identities that we can create, often are taken out at that point for younger pastors who can generate a little more adrenaline. So I guess part of the thing is keep the old guys up front if you can, because they may help us. But maybe the last thing I would suggest as a practice that might help us in our temptation, if this is a temptation, to seek our identity and coolness, would be the practice of daily confession, which is, if practiced long enough, will keep us close to the cross for our identity. But I'll tell you this, the flesh is brilliant. The flesh is genius. It can co-opt anything. And I can imagine confession being co-opted by cool, and here's how it would go. I could imagine a young hipster saying, I think I'm going to engage in daily confession. It's cool. It's something kind of ancient. It's something kind of exotic. I think I'll do it. All right, fair enough. So the first week of confession goes by, and it's kind of interesting now. They are now the romantic journeyer in confession. And they say to people kind of, hey, I'm practicing the ancient practice of daily confession. And they're cool. They're an experimenter. Fair enough. Second week of confession, it's getting a little bit harder. It's getting a little tedious to name the same sins over and over again. But they're going to stick with it because they are the spiritual hero. Third week of confession, this is not so cool anymore. It's not changing me into the hero I thought it would be. I'm not distinguishing myself by my growth. Frankly, it's getting a little monotonous. These are the same old sins every day. And so at the third week, confession is not at all cool anymore. They feel empty, needy, tired of the truth of themselves, their depravity, and many at this point will give up. They'll move on to some other cool spiritual discipline like solitude or something. If they stick with it, though, this is what will happen. In the fifth week of confession, and these are weeks or more like stages, I give up the pursuit of trying to use my faith and the disciplines to be cool. I give it up to achieve some type of status through confession or some other practice. And I begin to realize that my only joy is to be found in the fact that God forgives. I give up trying to use my Christianity for status. As Paul says, I don't want a righteousness of my own, I want a righteousness of Christ. Now that would be cool. That would be cool. And as Brett suggests in his book, maybe there is a cool version of Christianity. Maybe Christianity can be cool if it gives us one. I would suggest that maybe Christianity would be beautiful. I don't know if this is the next word coming. This could be the next trend. Not cool Christianity, but beautiful Christianity, and that'll get co-opted and that'll be a mess too. But that would be more than cool. That would be beautiful to see someone who has so given up using their faith for status and just acknowledge their need. And of course, the result would be humility and love. So can the church do without cool? That's a question Brett asks. Well, I hope we can do without cool, on the one hand. It's tiring. It's self-absorbing. It tempts me to rely on an identity sometimes apart from Christ. But now I'm going to reverse myself a little bit and say this as the last thing. I'm the father of 2 teenage girls, 13 and 17. I am so grateful for their youth leaders. And I don't know if it's cool that is drawing my kids into the church, or if it's fun, or if it's relationships, but they're doing something that has brought my children into the church and has put them on the road of spiritual development. I have no doubt that some of the things they're doing, that they're purveying cool a little bit. They're selling cool. I have no doubt that's a part of it. I am so thankful for them, though. Now, may I have to do some correcting later on? I may have to. They may have to unlearn some things about the gospel or relearn some things about the gospel if they become too attached to cool. But I will say this, I am so thankful for them because I think they love my children, and I think that whatever versions of cool they've done them in love for my children. Wow, so I'm thankful for them. So that puts me in an interesting place regarding cool and culture. Thanks for letting me say a few words.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.